This is everything that I have learned about knitted fabrics over the last 7 years working as a sportswear designer. Do you ever wonder how your favorite t-shirt is made? How is the fabric that you touch and feel made? Well, you'd be surprised to know that the majority of fabrics around the world are based on one fundamental technology: knitting. We have the main two types of fabrics that you see in the market. On the one hand is woven fabric, similar to what I'm wearing, and on the other hand, which is a revolutionary fabric, and this is knitted fabric. I'm going to give you guys my full overview, a full beginner's guide to someone who has zero knowledge on what knitted fabric is, and we'll go through what knitting fabric is, what are the different types of knitted fabrics, what you need to know about the yarn thicknesses of knitted fabrics, what are the different types of machines that create knitted fabrics, and ultimately, by the end of this episode, you'll walk away with a much better understanding of how your favorite t-shirt is made. So whether you're an aspiring sportswear designer or a brand entrepreneur or just someone who is curious on how your garments are made, this is going to be the episode for you. So to start right off, we have to understand that there's sort of two categories of knitting. On the one hand, you have what is known as hand knitting, and then on the other hand, we have what is known as machine knitting. And each of these categories have two subcategories within them, which is weft and warp knitting. Machine knitting is essentially what it sounds like. It is when the knitted structure is made using a machine. And there's a variety of machines that we're going to go into in this episode that create these kinds of fabrics. And on the other hand, you have hand knitting, which is sort of an old grandma who is sitting down on her chair and she's knitting a fabric. Both of them actually use the same methodologies, but it is the machinery or the automation that's involved that separates machine knitting from hand knitting. But in each of these categories, you have what is known as weft knitting and warp knitting. Weft knitting and warp knitting have to do with the direction of the loops of the yarns. That is essentially what separates weft fabrics from warp knitted fabrics. It's the directionality of the loops that are used to create the fabrics. When it comes to weft knitting, we essentially have two different types of weft knitting. We have circular weft knitting and we have flat weft knitting. Something like a circular weft knitting is when you look at a pair of Gymshark seamless leggings. It's a machine that has a series of needles that are arranged in a circular formation. And with flat knitting, it's the same idea, except the fabric is flat and it comes out in a more longitudinal sort of formation. Whereas with warp knitting, a completely different type of machine is created, and it's also sort of created on a flat formation, similar to the flat version of the weft knit. The second thing that we have to understand is the construction of knitted fabrics. When you look at a fabric, you're essentially going to see these raised columns and then these recessed or valleys. Essentially, these raised columns and these recesses happen because of the way that the yarns are interlooped within each other. There's two parts of the structure. The first part is called the wale. The wale is essentially where the loops are at their highest point and they create these vertical columns that go straight up and down the fabric, versus the courses, which tend to be going horizontally, which is essentially where recesses of the fabric are. When you look at weft knitted fabrics, these courses tend to be straight up and down, versus if we look at a warp fabric. Remember I mentioned that you sort of have a zigzag structure? This has to do with how the yarn is knitted within each other, or it's looped within each other. This is one of the easiest ways to tell apart a weft knitted fabric from a warp knitted fabric. Now we move on to the different types of stitches. The types of stitches relates to how the yarn is interlaced row by row. And actually, machines can augment or can modify how the yarn is interlaced into each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 main types of stitches that can be used on either warp knitting or weft knitting, depends. The plain stitch is basically a regular stitch. It's where the loop itself interlaces perfectly behind the next loop. You have the purl stitch, which is very similar to a plain stitch, except it's almost the opposite. So instead of having it go underneath, you have it go on top, which creates a bit more of a raised texture. Same time, next we have a transfer stitch. A transfer stitch is essentially where instead of having the loop go through where it needs to go, it's transferred to the next column over and it creates an opening. This is an easy way to create a mesh opening or a hole opening, which is what you tend to see on jersey mesh fabrics. Next, you have the spread stitch. Spread stitch is kind of similar to a transfer stitch, except you don't take the entire loop and you just transfer it over. You take the loop and you loop it through 2 columns and then you come back. Next, you have the mise. You essentially miss a row, but you don't move it over. You just have the top of the loop go straddle across 2 columns, which creates a bit more of an open stitch. You also have what is known as the tuck stitch, which essentially means when you're looking at it vertically, the loops themselves, as they go through row by row, it straddles 2 rows. So one of the loops doesn't go into the next row, it straddles 2 rows, which opens up the fabric, which can create, again, a dimple mesh or some bit more of an open mesh structure. And then lastly, you have the cross. So if we were to look at the yarn and how it loops, it's essentially a perfect loop. With a cross, it would cross over before it gets to the top and come back down and cross back over, and this creates a pinching formation. So when we knit fabrics, how do we determine this smoothness? The smoothness comes down to the density of yarn stitches per a specific section. So how much of those yarns or those needles do we have refers to the machine gauge. Closer to the needles, which essentially means the finer the knit. That's one sort of way to understand this. When you have sweaters and knitwear, which tend to have more coarse structures, you'll tend to have machine gauges like 1.5, 3, 7, 9, 10, and even 12, depending on the fineness of the yarn that is required. But if you tend to see much more smoother structures, something like 20 to 30 would be for fine menswear, and then something between 30 and 40 machine gauge would be for fine women's wear, something like intimates or something that you would be wearing closer to the skin. So when we create knitted fabrics, the understanding here is that not all knitted fabric are created equal. In some cases, we have the garment comes out finished directly from the machine. This we call as the integral methodology of using knitted fabric, where the garment itself is produced in a singular piece, so that requires a very minimal labor after the fact in order to construct the garment. The advantage here is that there's a very low labor cost, and ultimately there's a low wastage because you're just creating exactly what you need, and this saves a lot on sewing time. Typically, factories that are able to do garments like this don't need a high capacity of skilled physical labor, they just need skilled technicians, which is the drawback. In the middle, we have what is known as fully fashion. Here in fully fashion, it's sort of a hybrid. You get the garment in its semi-finished state, so you might get the torso in one piece, you might get the sleeve in one piece, and you might get the collar in one piece, and then laborers are required to put everything together. The advantage here is that there's a little to no cutting waste because you're not using a traditional cut and sew methodology where you have a flat fabric and you're cutting the excess fabric out of it, but you have a lower volume of production simply because you're only creating the parts of the garment that you need. And then lastly is what we have what is known as all cut or traditional cut and sew, where the fabric itself is sort of flat, or it could even be on a tube, and laborers come in and they cut out the pieces and they sew them together. The big advantage here is that you have a much higher production rate because you can really create these optimized sections of your factory where you're moving the mass manufacturing fabric onto the next section of people just cutting them in heaps. The disadvantage is it's very labor intensive, which essentially means that you may have a lot of quality control issues since you have to integrate people into the mix. And there's a much higher fabric wastage since you're actually losing a lot of the excess fabric that's being cut out of the fabric that's being thrown away as scraps. Well guys, that is it. That is a wrap on this episode. If you guys have had an attentive eye, you'll notice that I've been using the textile PDF from Fashionary. It's a great book. As you can see, my copy is pretty much, I've been using it for the last 5 years. This is not a sponsored video. I just really enjoy using these books from Fashionary. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please consider smashing a massive thumbs up. I know it was quite technical, but I enjoy putting out these technical episodes every now and then. Let me know in the comments below that you are enjoying this and what other types of topics you want to see me cover in future episodes. And I say this from the very bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Fit Design TV. Until next week's episode, stay awesome.